Okay, today's discussion is based on the ethnic variations from Cass's model of lesbian and gay identity development, based on the article Ethnic-Related Variations from the Cass Model of Homosexual Identity Formation, The Experiences of Two-Spirit, Lesbian and Gay Native Americans, by Heather Adams and Layli Phillips. So to begin this discussion, we're just going to review Cass's stages of development first. This model became very popular as one of the stage models of identity development through its 6 stages. So we begin with this sort of pre-phase where everyone is assumed to be heterosexual as part of our heteronormative society, and this before any sort of identity development starts to begin. The first stage is the initial confusion felt by someone who's beginning to acknowledge their LGBT identity, and that'll flow into comparison to others, trying to figure out what's normal, how they are, how they feel, how they think compared to how others do that. And then this growing tolerance of learning about other identities, learning how they exist, becoming slightly more comfortable with them, though maybe not identifying with them personally, moving towards acceptance, where that personal identification begins to form, where that acceptance forms and grows, eventually turning into pride in that identity, being able to accept it, and then being able to fully synthesize it with the whole of the human person. And what Cass says drives the movement between these phases is the interpersonal congruence theory. And this theory has 3 main facets, where it is a characteristic that someone attributes to themselves, the behavior that relates to that characteristic, and how other people view those characteristics and behaviors. And Cass says that when there's incongruence between these 3 things, when society's norms disagree with how a person is feeling and behaving, that creates some conflict or dissonance inside of a person that they want to try to decrease. And Cass says that these behaviors that decrease this incongruence and help build acceptance are what moves these person in their behaviors through the 6 stages and forms their identity. Some of the assumptions made by this model are first that it is universal. Cass said that this is the way that lesbian and gay identities developed in all people, and also that it was linear, that everyone would begin in that pre-phase and move neatly from stages 1 through 6. Cass also assumed that identity development was independent of social factors. So things like race, status, age, class did not contribute to how an identity developed. And most of Cass's model was based on observations of white cisgender gay males, typically the norm that we would see, or just the majority of the population. And for any other group that didn't fit that model, it was just generalized, assumed to fit them as well. So in the context of this research, the researchers were looking at LGBT Native Americans. Some key terms that we're going to be using during this discussion are two-spirit. And so this is the modern term for Native Americans who identify as lesbian, gay, transgender, or who otherwise display some sort of gender role that is not expectant of their assigned gender. And then we have third gender male-bodied, fourth gender female-bodied. These are similar describing words, but these describe the people who Native Americans, before European colonization, distributed these same types of, breaking gender roles, not doing the norm. So the 2 kind of paralleled each other. Two-spirit is more of a contemporary term. TGMB, FB are used for ancestors, essentially. Near at the bottom, the Ringte and the Nadli, those are tribal-specific terms for that same concept. TGMB and FGFB are more blanket terms that are used across all tribes. So this research specifically was looking at social location and ethnicity in regards to identity development. So social location can be thought of as where someone is within society in relation to other people around them. So this is anything from your occupation, where you work, your sexuality, where you physically live, all these different things that we would use to help describe ourselves or to form our identity. And specifically, ethnicity was the focus of this research. And research identified a few key things that ethnicity impacts during identity development. And the first and the largest one is the degree of acceptance that LGBT people receive. And the following 4 facets help to increase or decrease that acceptance. So spiritual sanctions include whether or not spirituality and religion accept of and approve of LGBT identities, or whether they disapprove of it. Histories impact how stories are told about ancestors within the LGBT community, so whether or not there are people who came before you who shared that same identity. Life guidelines refers to all the different expectations that are placed on an LGBT person and how they are thought to behave and contribute to society, and inclusion in LGBT spaces as far as recognition in the literature and community events, whether they are accepted or whether there is racism or any other sort of discrimination present. And so in this research, trying to figure out how a Native American ethnicity impacted identity development, two groups of Native Americans and their identities emerged. So group one displayed all of the characteristics of Cass's model of development, where they reported going through a very difficult process of confusion, comparison, attempting to pass as cisgender and heterosexual, essentially being closeted, and taking a very long time to reach the stage of acceptance with their identity. But a second group emerged who didn't display that, and who noted that they knew of their LGBT identity from the time that they were very young and accepted it from that time as well. And so these researchers wanted to figure out, why did this one group of two-spirit, lesbian, and gay Native Americans lack this developmental process that Cass said would apply to everybody? And so three of those concepts that affected earlier the level of acceptance that LGBT people receive were the spiritual sanctions, the histories, and the life guidelines. And what they found was that in these Native American communities, there was a much higher degree of spiritual sanctioning than in most North American society today. And in this regard, being outside of gender norms was seen as a benefit, as a spiritual connection that most people in Native American communities didn't have such a high degree of. Whereas in our predominantly Christian society, most of the time, gender variants or sexualities that are not heterosexual are seen as deviant, as spiritually lacking, as disconnected and cut off from God. And so in the Native American side, we have this acceptance and this positive benefit, whereas in Christianity, there's a very negative connotation. Second is the representation in history. In the Native American tribes, we saw these TGMB and FGFB, where ancestors hundreds of years ago displayed these same gender variant attributes. Whereas in Western culture, the words gay, transgender, they didn't develop until much more recently. And in doing that, we can't look at ancestors the same way because we can't retroactively apply those terms. Whereas the Native Americans who display these alternative gender roles, they accepted those roles while they were alive. It's not that we're looking back and saying that they were different, it's that during that time they were acknowledged. And that was part of their identity and their life. And from that, they have these specific social roles where these gender variant people are generally expected to be teachers, mediators, and spiritual leaders because they are seen as having a high degree of connection to the spiritual world. So not only are they acknowledged in history, but they are given a very clear, positive role in society. And so the implications that this research has is that what Cass said is the interpersonal congruence theory drives the changes between the stages of development. But in these Native American tribes, who experience much lower levels of homophobia or heterosexism, there's no initial incongruence between society and the person who has an LGBT identity. And without that incongruence, there's no need for them to develop their identity over time. It is simply something that is a part of them and that they can accept. And so in that case, it's not that they differ from Cass's model, it's that they, from the very beginning, fall outside of the model as a whole. And second, we can see that clearly social location and ethnicity do make an impact on this identity development because their process was much different than Cass would have predicted because of their Native American identity. And what we see in this is that it's always important to remember that intersectionality affects identity. We know that what a woman experiences is different from what a Black person experiences, is different from what a Black woman experiences. And so in the same way, we can't expect that all people who are gay or lesbian or transgender will have the same experience because if they are white, Black, Asian, mixed race, biracial, Native American, that's going to have a different impact. Similarly, these Native American communities who see these LGBT identities as more positive don't have the same fallacy of misplaced scales that our society often falls subject to. So whereas sometimes LGBT identities are seen as negative and then alternately associated with sinners and crime, these other communities where they're viewed as positive there is not that exponential effect of attributing multiple negative things to one person. It is seen as good, and there is no building consequences to that. We also see a highlighting of the privilege and power and false binaries that heteronormativity generates. With the heteronormativity, with assuming people to be heterosexual, that's how we get the theory of coming out and how that kind of subverts those power roles and acknowledges heterosexual as dominant or as the norm. If that is not assumed and people are free to be of any gender identity and any sexuality, then it's much more free and a lot of that power is disseminated. And also we see the importance of queer history and what it means to have ancestors who are similar to you and who have similar stories and who can impact how other people see and perceive you. So some things to think about going forward from this are what changes might we see in the levels of acceptance, spiritual sanctioning, history, life guidelines, and inclusion for other groups, like African American LGBT people, Jewish LGBT people, or the elderly LGBT people. Because the overlapping effects of racism, of religious persecution, of prejudice against the elderly, all these things are going to have a much different effect on how that identity plays out and is displayed and is embraced. And also looking at how the effects of TGMB and FB, my mistake, history on trans or lesbian, two-spirit lesbian, and gay Native Americans, how that affects them today. How could our behavior today impact identity development of LGBT people 100 years from now? And that is the end of my presentation. I can figure out how to stop recording.